Oh, okay.
Hey, we're live. Like I said, we definitely fucking need an intro video. I think that my intro video at this point is just going to be like me saying that we need an intro video. I'm going to have to try and put some music behind it. Anyway, what's up? Welcome, everybody. My name is James McCool. I'm the owner of PaydirtDFS.com. We are going to be doing a Slate Talk today, going over week 13. If you guys have not tuned into this one before, this one is kind of more game theory and value centric, not so much the play this player or play this player. That being said, we do have a special guest this week. We have Scott Barrett joining us from FantasyPts.com. Scott Barrett is incredible. He's a total badass with probably the best mustache in the industry. I don't think anybody really competes. There's a lot of beards in the industry. I have a beard, but there's not that many mustaches. So, how are you and your mustache doing today, Scott?
Doing pretty good. This is like a once a year kind of thing. This is an ironic mustache. Had a beard up until a few hours ago. When I do like one or two mustache weeks out of the NFL season, and those are always our most profitable weeks. So we did it for good luck. My wife will be home in a few hours. She will be very upset with me, but hopefully it'll be worth it.
Well, hey, I mean, happy to have you on your most profitable week. That's sick. Margaret, what are you going to say?
Well, Thanksgiving, so the Sunday after Thanksgiving is also historically one of my most profitable slates. I think it's because, people are distracted by traveling, food, seeing family. You kind of have like two main slates on one week. But Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, today I did nothing but just, research, dive deep into the slate. So again, this is historically one of my most profitable slates. So I'm going to be about like 3x my typical, the money I have down this week. So and we got the lucky mustache. So hopefully this works well. I'm excited to do this. I should have said this at the top, but I think really highly of you, James. I think you're absolutely brilliant, and your strong suit is one of my weak spots. So I'm really eager to have this conversation and learn from you and talk some game theory.
Fuck yeah. Love that. Now that my head is going to be larger than the camera can show, Pablo, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. It's a great week. The kids, I have 3 kids they get the week off of school. We were in New York City for a few days. We spent the day hanging out. I like this slate. I share Scott's sentiments. This has generally been a fairly profitable time of the year for me. I think it's a combination of, like he said, folks being a little distracted, and we just have good data now too, right? And I think we're deep enough into the season now where we have good data and leaning into the game theory. I think this week is actually a really, really interesting. I sort of looked forward to talking with you guys more tonight than I usually do, because I think there's some decisions that are a bit of a microcosm for how this year has gone in terms of how we approach roster construction and leaning into some of the chalk versus fading it. I think is going to be pretty critical in terms of how we approach a slate.
Yeah, I have done now just like a couple articles on the slate. I wrote one over for DraftKings Nation, and I wrote one for Fantasy Life, obviously. But as I was breaking it down, there were a couple things that stuck out to me. We'll talk at large about one of them and probably a little bit at the other one. But one, when I look at chalk overall, which I'm showing on the screen right now. First off, Chase Brown as mega chalk. That's going to be a decision that you have to make. I think personally, based on projections, based on salary, everything, he's $1,500 too cheap. At the very least, like if he isn't the best value on the slate, I think he's the second best value on the slate, just from a pure projection standpoint. Now, I do understand from
who even would be number one,
Adonai Mitchell, and we'll talk about him in a bit.
Oh, music to my ears. Yeah. Let's go, baby.
Yeah, I thought you'd like that. Adonai Mitchell is fucking Scott's boy. Chase Brown, so he's projected to be 32% owned. I think that he will likely, it's kind of one of those interesting spots where I don't think that the ownership will be crazy, like 50% plus, but I do see somewhere between 35 and 45%, depending on what contest you're playing in. And it's because, like, if you look at baselines and if you look at role and if you look at expectation for Chase Brown, he should be $7,500. He has the same role as somebody like an Alvin Kamara or a Kyron Williams or a Kenneth Walker. Like he is a bell cow back since basically week 7. So for him to be priced at 6,200 is just crazy sauce. He's no worse than Bijan Robinson at the very least. So I think at 32% owned, like the only reason why you don't play him is if you think that you're going to be doing a Cincinnati stack, I think. And that kind of goes into the regular construction that I go with. But Pablo, you had said in our texts and in our group chat with Gordy, shout out Gordy, that you were not sold on him. So I need you to talk me through that a little bit.
So look, when I said this slate is kind of a microcosm of the year, and I don't want to get too philosophical, but stick with me for a second. Last year, before Sims really had fully percolated throughout the industry, we did a lot of sort of traditional building where you would have a game stack or, a stack with a bring back and some mini correlations. And then throughout the year last year, and especially this year, we've seen what I like to call sort of more NBA style roster construction, where it's more sort of optimal builds with maybe a skinny stack, maybe a mini or two. People are playing a lot more one-offs. And it's because I think it's a number of things. Number one, I think the pricing has been loose enough on DraftKings where you can build that way. And you don't necessarily need to lean into the correlation. Number two, a lot of the high game total environments just haven't gotten there. Like we've had multiple weeks with high total game environments that didn't shoot out, and the people who sort of leaned into those games didn't get there. And then number three, the Sims. I mean, the Sims have sort of, I think, pushed a lot of people to sort of doing away with some of the traditional, heuristics of how you build a lineup. So how does that relate to the question about Chase Brown? I think this week is a little bit of, do you want to sort of lean into a game, and I'll just say like a game like Baltimore, Philadelphia with a magnificent game total that looks extremely underowned, and then be okay eating a chalk piece or two around it like Chase Brown, because I think from a usage standpoint, he's perfectly fine chalk. Or are you going to build sort of, call it the more modern approach, where you're building almost like a cash build with some pivots? And do you think that by getting away from what's going to be the chalk build, which is going to be Chase Brown, probably Alvin Kamara across Puka or Cup, with either Herbert or Richardson, do you think getting away from that and paying up at running back to like a Bijan or a Mixon, who I think is a fantastic play this week, gets you enough in the name of upside, where yes, from a point per dollar standpoint, you're sacrificing a lot with Chase Brown, but in the name of total lineup leverage and upside, you're willing to do that. And I'm not sure. I'll probably build 2 to 3 hand builds this week. And I'm guessing I'll have Chase Brown if I build 3 and 2 of them. But I do think I think it's worth thinking about, right? If I didn't think he was going to be so owned, I don't think it's a debate. But in a week where he's going to be at least 40%, maybe, and I do think he'll be like around 50 in small field where it's high dollar pay up. Yeah. Do you think that you can get enough in the name of value elsewhere and to get up to like a Mixon who could break the slate or someone like that, right? And I think that's what it comes down to. Now, if you're going to lean into a game like Baltimore, Philadelphia, that's just not going to be very owned, I have less of a problem with it. I think it just comes down to total lineup leverage. But I don't think he's bad chalk. I think it just comes down to sort of roster construction, and do you have enough leverage where you're okay eating what you think is good chalk or not?
Scott, how do you look at Chase Brown this week? I mean, in the Paydirt models, he looks like the best value at running back. I pulled it up here for just running backs, but from a baseline standpoint, it's just hard for me to argue with him.
Yeah, I think if he was $900 more expensive, he'd still be far and away the best running back value this slate. And something I've discovered from doing like lineup study, looking at some of the top DFS players, they're very much eating the running back chalk this season, and that's not really something that's hurt them. You look at the analytics on, he's had 100% of the team's backfield touches since that Zach Moss injury. Over those weeks, he's finished first, second, and first in XFP. Their left tackle was out all those games. He should be coming back this week. Just like Christian McCaffrey-esque volume, where you're talking about 21 carries, 8 targets per game. So he's largely game script immune. Personally, I think I'm going to have like, I don't know, 85% exposure and like Khalil Herbert on 1 milli lineup. And that's about as far as it gets for me in terms of trying to get away from him.
Yeah, it's hard. And Pablo, to your point of like looking for value elsewhere, I think on this slate, when you're considering value, there are pieces to like. We'll talk about Adonai Mitchell in a sec. I know Scott's just shivering in excitement. But
I can see his mustache actually like trembling when you mention his name.
It's curling itself. The handlebar.
There are value pieces. You know, when we're just looking at running backs, though, Chase Brown is just far and away. And then Alvin Kamara at 7,700 is second best, 20% 4x rate. And then Bucky Irving is a massive drop down to 11%, followed by Rashad White, right? I mean, the one pivot that I think you can reliably make, and I ran the pivot finder here, but I think that the one pivot that you can reliably make on Chase Brown is Aaron Jones. I do think that Aaron Jones at like 6% owned is a really, really good play off of Chase Brown. But I'll give the caveat that I don't even think that you make that swap just as a swap. I think that what you do is you put in something into your optimizer rules and you say, if this lineup does not have Chase Brown, 1, have a Cincinnati stack, and 2, if it's a Cincinnati stack, you probably just use Aaron Jones. I think that the roster construction heuristics for this week, whereas you're going to be paying either 2 mid-range running backs or 1 pay up, 1 pay down, depending on how you look at Adonai Mitchell and David Moore. I think that a lot of people are going to be building the same way, and I don't have a problem with that. The problem is that if you're building the same way, you're probably locked onto Chase Brown. So I look at him as, if you're playing in anything that is single entry, I don't know why you would get away from him. If you're playing in anything that's 3 max, I don't know why you would get away from him. But as soon as you reach into the larger fields or the 20 max or the 150 max, I do think that there is reason to play a Cincinnati stack specifically. I can't see very many scenarios where you don't play either of them. But speaking of Cincinnati stacks, that is actually something worth talking about here, because the ownership on T. Higgins also is going to be pretty massive. But people won't play him with Chase Brown, so I don't think that his ownership is going to get that high. I imagine him 25 to 30% owned. But T. Higgins, and I'll throw this over to you, Scott, in a second, has been one of the best wide receivers in the league in the games that he's played. So at 6,600, like, if you're not playing Chase Brown, I think you're definitely playing T. Higgins. And is there a world where you just play both of them without Joe Burrow? Like, how much of Cincinnati do we actually want to have? Their team total isn't that healthy. It's good, but it's not that healthy. So how much would you play Chase Brown and T. Higgins together?
I probably wouldn't. I like the idea of trying to get away from Higgins by getting to Jamar Chase. Higgins, like, obvious cash play. He's our top point per dollar wide receiver this slate. Argument for that is easy, but we're expecting Joey Porter Jr. to shadow T. Higgins. Not everyone has it that way. Mike Clay thinks he shadows Jamar Chase, but he's been shadowing the team's X receiver all year, all of last year, and that's Higgins. And so that puts Jamar Chase in a more favorable matchup, maybe more volume. And then this is the best schematic matchup Jamar Chase is going to get all year against a team that deploys a lot of single high coverage. So I think that's the way around it. when we were talking about running backs, it's like Chase Brown to me is like undeniable, even at that ownership percentage. And then, I can get away from Alvin Kamara. I can get away from the Buccaneers running backs. I love Aaron Jones. With the wide receivers, Higgins, I don't know. I don't know that this is a spot where we see the true ceiling outcome. And, as good as he's been, like, who is the wide receiver on that team with the slate wrecking upside? It's typically Jamar Chase. So maybe that's a unique way to get around it.
Yeah, so I want to bring up a topic about T. Higgins that and this leads into a little bit of the Colts discussion as well, which is that what are your guys' thoughts on playing a T. Higgins or a Mitchell, and I'll throw Pittman in there as an example too, naked versus with the quarterback? Because, like, I'm not basing this off of lineup study, but I feel that if you're going to play a T. Higgins, who I think has a safe median, but I don't think has a slate wrecking ceiling like Jamar Chase does. My inclination is usually to sort of do that more if I'm using the quarterback. And similarly, I think there's going to be a lot of naked A-Rich, and I think there's going to be a lot of one-off Higgins, or maybe some Higgins Brown lineups. But I'm not sure if I'm going to play Higgins. Like, I'm almost for sure playing a Burrow stack with him. Like, I don't really have a whole lot of desire to play Higgins by himself. Similarly, if I'm playing A-Rich, I feel the need to play Pittman or Mitchell. And I understand that A-Rich can get there with his legs, but to get to his ceiling, he's usually bringing at least one of those guys with him. So I just feel like if you're going to hit on the receiver or on the quarterback, I still think there's something to trying to maximize that correlative upside. And I don't know that we're there yet, but I want to bring up the same topic around the Rams because Puka and Kupp are going to be super owned, but Stafford, interestingly, doesn't project very well and doesn't look very owned at all. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about as well.
So first off, Scott, your expertise on like the coverage stuff, we just don't have that shit here. So like that's super valued. I didn't even think about that. When we talk about that slate breaking upside, I do think that Jamar Chase certainly from he could have 13 targets, 11 receptions for 180 yards and 3 touchdowns. Like T. Higgins just doesn't have that. That being said, Jamar Chase is $2,000 more expensive. So I think that's baked into the price quite a bit. And when comparing T. Higgins versus Jamar Chase, I'm not even sure that I make that comparison. I think you have to make that comparison on that slate, but it's not typically a comparison that I would make because one, Jamar Chase is almost always more expensive, and two, when you're looking at T. Higgins versus the rest of the field, I think you really are comparing him versus guys who are going to be, I don't want to say equally owned at the price because that's not what I'm looking for. But like Higgins, I'm looking at him against somebody like Garrett Wilson or George Pickens. I'm not looking at him against Justin Jefferson. I'm not looking at him against, AJ Brown. Like T. Higgins is not in that group.
Well, then what about Mike Evans, 100 cheaper, who has more upside?
Right. Yeah. So that's what you have to think about. And if we look at the pivot finder, then we can kind of like draw some stuff about that. George Pickens, Jackson Smith-Njigba, and Garrett Wilson are the 3 main comparison players that we have here, right? That are within range. Higgins projects for 18.74, so he projects higher than all 3 of those guys, but they're within range, within medians, and they're within range in terms of price. And all of them are going to be drastically lower owned. Like Pickens at 6%. I would argue that Pickens and T. Higgins have the same ceiling. We know that Jackson Smith-Njigba and T. Higgins have the same ceiling. We know that Garrett Wilson and T. Higgins have the same ceiling. So, Pablo, to your point on if you would play T. Higgins naked, I would not. I think that we have 3. If you want to include Mike Evans, I have Mike Evans projected a bit lower, but if you want to include him there, because I agree that his ceiling is the same as T. Higgins, like there's at least 4 wide receivers that I think that you can put in the same range and ceiling as T. Higgins, who, yeah, they project a little bit less, but their ownership is going to be 20% of what T. Higgins is. None of these guys are going to be over 10% owned. So I would not play him alone. I think that the situation of Anthony Richardson and Adonai Mitchell, that's very different, because you're not going to find very many wide receivers priced around Adonai Mitchell that I think have his ceiling. The problem is that I do think last week we saw Josh Downs. He was projected for 6% ownership. And when the cards flipped, he was 20%, 22% owned. And I am unfortunately absolutely convinced that that's going to happen this week with Adonai Mitchell as well, who right now projects for, not in the top 10 ownership. He projects for 9% ownership. That's not going to fucking happen. I promise you right now that Adonai Mitchell is going to come in at 20%, and it's going to break my heart. But I think he's at the very least the second best value on this slate, and I'm building up the eruption for Scott here. But I think that he's going to be a really, really valuable piece. But all of that to be said, T. Higgins versus Mike Evans versus, if you want to put Ladd McConkey in there, Drake London, all of these guys are kind of these guys have volume and an 8 out of 10 and get end zone receptions that. They're all there. So, Scott, I don't know if you want to add anything on to that. You mentioned Mike Evans. You like Mike Evans here?
Yeah, I like him a lot. So just Adonai Mitchell real quick. I don't know why he would be 20%. Is it because he should be? Because he should be. But looking at industry aggregate, he's really low. He's below David Moore on every site. Every podcast I've listened to, they were like, who do you like more, Adonai Mitchell or David Moore? David Moore. David Moore, who had a 0.98 yards per route run heading into last week. Now it's at 1.17. He has 2 double-digit fantasy point performances since the Obama administration. Makes absolutely no sense to me. Adonai Mitchell, we have a stat average separation score, which he is elite at. It's going to be a man-heavy matchup, or a top 5 man matchup. Adonai Mitchell leads the team in catches against man coverage, which is insane because the dude has cleared a 20% snap share in only 3 games this year. I'm all in. I'm biased because we call him the ass god over at our site because of average separation score. But he's a conviction play for me. If he's 20%, I'm fine. He's just so much a better play than a 33-year-old 29-year-old David Moore. I hate that. And then, Mike Evans, I like a lot. I think look at what Cade Otton did without Mike Evans. And so it's what kind of role does a fully healthy Mike Evans step into? Probably something that transcends that Cade Otton role, which was awesome. And then it's a great matchup. It's a great schematic matchup. And so I think he is an ideal pivot, but I also really like George Pickens. It's just in that same game. So you would know better than me, the correlation kind of makes it tricky. And then JSN too, he seems under-owned for a guy who's, averaging 27 fantasy points per game over his last 3. So there certainly are pivot spots. But this is where I get lost, right? You guys are the game theory experts. According to our projections, T. Higgins is the best value play. And so it really just comes down to ownership and balancing, upside versus that.
Hey, Scott, before you move off of the Colts, you're a ball knower. So what about Pittman? Because he's been sort of banged up a bit this year, right? He had that back injury. He's shown signs of life, I think, in terms of targets over the last couple of weeks. I think A-Rich generally has led to better Pittman games. There is, I think, some concern, right, where the Patriots have the lockdown corner.
Christian Gonzalez is going to shadow him.
Yeah. Okay, so that was my question for you. So do you expect him to shadow him, and does that concern you with Pittman?
Yeah, it does a little bit. It's also the fact that this was I think he's over the back injury, but it was a back injury that for weeks people are it's a miracle. His teammates were saying it's a miracle he's even playing. I don't know how he's not on IR. And so he did well last week. It was a game without Josh Downs, Alec Pierce banged up. But it was his first game with double-digit fantasy points in over a month. If I remember correctly, I think he had three of his catches came on the final drive of the game in garbage time. I don't know. To me, the lean is Alec Pierce, who's like crushing in this stat. When you're an elite separator like Adonai Mitchell is, it's ideally like it leads to more targets, but what it really does is it points towards upside, your potential to score touchdowns or break off big plays. And I also think that's like a great fit for Richardson's archetype, as well as this matchup. The Patriots are giving up a ton of yards on busted coverage, a ton of yards deep. And so to me, just looking at the price differential and contrasting upside, to me, it's really like Adonai Mitchell by a landslide. Pittman could get there, but like, I don't know. It's just not the way I want to approach it.
James, to piggyback on something Scott brought up that I mentioned, which is the weight that you put into correlative sort of relationships versus not. I think, I sort of somewhat ironically posted in our Discord today, I'm sorry to tell you guys, this is another 2024 slate, which is my way of saying that it's a slate where we don't play the sort of traditional way with correlative maximization, which, as you know, is kind of the way I love to play, which is why I love baseball and hockey DFS. I guess for this slate specifically, but more on a broader sort of game theory standpoint, James, because that you are that guy. Where do you stand? I'll tell you mine is that I'm somewhere in between where I used to be, which is that I think that I've significantly moved off the need to correlate in football as much as I used to. But I still think it's actually become a little undervalued now because of how many sort of optimally built cash type lineups we have in GPPs.
Yeah. So the rule of thumb for baseball, we'll start there because baseball is super correlative. But the rule of thumb is for baseball, for every player that you add to a stack, you should add 2% of that stack's projection on top. That's super basic rule of thumb. Like if you have a 5-man stack, then your stack's 10% higher than median projection. For football, it's a little bit more complicated because you have a lot of negative correlations, right? Whereas you have, the running back and the quarterback are negatively correlated for the most part. Running backs and wide receivers are negatively correlated for the most part. So adding a running back typically is going to decrease the ceiling based on correlation of a median projection. But we don't usually even think about things like that, right? Like usually when you're thinking about the correlation, you're thinking about, if you do Anthony Richardson plus Adonai Mitchell plus Michael Pittman, like what is the boost that you get on top of the median? And wide receivers usually have somewhere between a 0.3 and 0.4 correlation coefficient. So we can usually add something like 4% on top of their median if you're wanting to do it in a super blunt way. But with somebody like you really don't want to do that with rushing quarterbacks. You want to do that with passing quarterbacks because their ceiling is entirely dependent on what they're doing. So that brings it back towards Mike Evans, I think, and Joe Burrow to a smaller extent, or T. Higgins to a smaller extent, where if you're going to be playing them, maximizing your ceiling is pairing them with a quarterback whose ceiling is directly affected by the touchdowns they can throw, not the touchdowns that they're going to run in. And Russell Wilson is a great example of that now. Like you straight up would not play Russell Wilson without like at least George Pickens and probably George Pickens and Pat Fryer. You have to have the upside there. Whereas somebody like, I don't know, even Brock Purdy can run a little bit. Like Baker Mayfield can run a little bit. We've seen Baker Mayfield actually use his legs a little bit more. So those correlation coefficients go down a little bit. But the moral of the story is when you are building out, it's just like what you were talking about with sheets earlier in the Discord. Like it feels uncomfortable, but maximizing your correlation is the way to get the highest ceiling that you possibly can. And in large field tournaments, that's what you want to do. You want all that volatility. You want that ceiling unlocked by the volatility of maximizing your correlations. In smaller fields, Pablo, you were saying that you might want to play with 1500 this week. Like you don't have to maximize correlation in smaller fields because you don't need the nuts to win the GPP. You need a good lineup. Your local maxima is going to be way lower than your global maxima, though. So from an algorithmic standpoint, like when we talk about correlation matters considerably more in two circumstances. One, large fields. Maximize correlation in large fields. Two, large slates. So the larger the slate is, the more you want to maximize your correlation, because the higher chance there is that one team absolutely obliterates the slate, aka a Cincinnati or Rams stack, right? Where we were going to talk about Puka and Cooper Kupp. Puka and Cooper Kupp are somebody who you pair them with Matthew Stafford in a large field because they have such strong correlation with Matthew Stafford and they have such a skinny amount of the target share that you want to maximize what happens if that game, if they score 35, 40 real life points. So hopefully that answers most of that. I'm going to break away
James,
for a sec. Really quick.
Sure.
I wanted to mention that Adonai Mitchell. So Scott, you had said that people are mentioning David Moore. I can't fucking figure out the David Moore chalk. I for the life of me, I cannot figure out the David Moore chalk. I am looking at, so I just ran the pivot finder on the top 5 overall top owned players. David Moore, for some reason, is fucking there. And his comps are Sterling Shepard, projected for 7, Tyler Boyd, projected for 6, Demarcus Robinson for 7, Adonai Mitchell for like fucking 12, and then Kayshon Boutte and Calvin Austin each for 7. I cannot. Who the fuck is playing David Moore and why?
I'll tell you why, because I've built a couple lineups, and the reason is because there's very few players that are below 4,200 this week that feel comfortable with anybody, and every major site is projecting David Moore as having a high volume role because of their injuries and because of the last 2 weeks he had, and so people feel like it's a very safe, not as fragile as you would expect punt play. And I think your points are both very well taken. He's like an older journeyman vet with, yeah.
Yeah, he had 2 catches for 18 yards 2 weeks ago. He's had one good game since the Obama administration, and it came last week. I don't know. ETR has him as a top 5 play of the week. I think Stochastic is up there. Blitz is up there.
That's right.
I just don't get it. I don't see it. Doesn't make sense to me.
He's a Butte, however you pronounce it, of 2 weeks ago or a week ago of this week. It's the same exact thing.
I think you could play Thielen as a leverage play. I think way more upside there. And then, Adonai Mitchell's my guy, James McCool, he's with me. So I love it.
Hey, James, before you break off, go ahead, James.
Here's what I would do. I just wouldn't tie myself to fucking Bryce Young. Why the fuck? I have no desire to play Bryce Young, David Moore, Adam Thielen, Jalen Coker. I have next year, maybe I'll be into Jalen Coker. I want to see more. And I also want them to get a real life NFL quarterback, but
and a life size quarterback as well.
I'm not fucking doing it. I don't understand how, this is the kind of thing. And this is always my favorite thing about DFS. And then Pablo, I'll let you get back to the point that you were going to make that actually probably matters more. But this is the thing that I love about DFS is that people say, oh, well, because ETR and Stochastic have this guy projected well, he must be a good play. Or they just aren't projecting him well. Or it's something where they're just over projecting somebody who's cheap, because when they build out lineups, and they run their optimizer and they say, oh, well, this guy's, we need value somewhere. Hey, here's somebody who might, based on last week, have a little bit better of a role than we would expect. And then they overproject them a little bit. And it's like this self-fulfilling prophecy of saying we need value, so I'm going to project somebody to be a good value. And then we end up with David Moore at 25% owned in week 13 of NFL DFS. And it's insanity.
I just want to say, when I have this level of confidence and conviction on something like this, I think I'm right 8 times out of 10, but I want to kill myself the other 2 out of 10 times.
Well, it hurts so bad, right? Because it fucks you so bad because of how owned they are.
I still have not lived down me talking massive shit about Geno Smith 2 years ago.
Kraft, bro, this year.
Oh, and Tucker Kraft. Yeah, Tucker Kraft, the worst goddamn play of the entire year so far, just nuking me to the goddamn moon.
Bro, he's averaging 3 XFP per game. It's insane.
It's awful. Anyway, Pablo, you have more important points to make here.
No. Look. Big picture, I think chalk analysis is probably the most important part of any slate, because that's where you're going to make your biggest stance, right? Like fading a chalk piece or playing a chalk piece is where it's the easiest way to gain or lose leverage on the field. So I think, the cheap value chalk is probably the number one area that people underestimate the fragility. For those people who don't know what fragility means, it means sort of how not robust is someone's projection, right? Like how unlikely or likely it is for them to get to their median plus or minus 1 or 2 standard deviations. And so in general, I think the punt wide receivers often garner massive overconfidence. And that's not true always. I mean, there are some times when you get a punt receiver who appropriately you can predict has a meaningful volume role. But more this week, and Boutte, or however the fuck you pronounce his name for the Patriots a week or two ago, it was the same thing. And to some degree, it's self-fulfilling, like you said, because people need value when you want to play some of the pay-ups. And it forces some more uncomfortable sort of fades or more balanced builds when you don't play that cheap value. You just have to acknowledge when you're doing that you may be diluting yourself by playing that value guy who probably is much more fragile than you'd like to admit. But what I wanted you to do is pull up the stacks because I think something that's interesting this week, 2 things. Number one, if you sort by median, number one, I think you will see, if I did my math right before the slate, that we have 17 stacks above Herbert stacks, who projects to be the chalk quarterback. Okay. So number one, I just want to point that out because Herbert's going to be really chalky, and we have 17 other options that project with a better median, and many who project with a better ceiling. Okay. Number two, we have a wonderful looking game environment in Baltimore, Philadelphia, with 2 quarterbacks that are going to be substantially lower owned than Herbert and A-Rich and a few other guys. So your sheets, James, love Hurts and Lamar, and I think we would be failing our people if we didn't point out their ownership and their upside in a game that admittedly isn't that easy to build. And the reason that they have low ownership is because all of the pairing pieces are pricey except for Goddard. And I'm not sure that you really want to play Goddard unless Devontae is out. We can debate that. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that, Scott, as a ball knower.
On what?
On Goddard. If Devontae is expected to play, right? So if Devontae wasn't playing, I think Goddard becomes a much better play, right? I don't know that we love Goddard with Devontae in. Am I cutting out, by the way? Because my connection kind of blows.
Good.
No, yeah, your video was kind of trash earlier, but now you're crystal clear. You're good.
So I love this tool. I think this tool is really cool. I think it's really sexy. It also like aligns with kind of how I'm approaching the slate. I think Stafford doubles are going to be my double spy lineup. For the power sweep, I'm going to go Burrow, Hurts, Baker, and then the spy, I have a Rich, Adonai Mitchell lineup where like almost just about everything else fits perfect and is unique. So we could touch on all those. I kind of want to stack it up a little differently with some of these, maybe, but I did want to touch on Justin Herbert chalk. And so I was debating John Proctor on Herbert in Discord just about an hour ago. If you don't know who John Proctor is, he's a DFS legend, potentially the greatest preseason DFS football player of all time. And so he was saying Justin Herbert is the nuts. He is Harbaugh's new Colin Kaepernick because he's running more. He's a freak athlete. He's like a Josh Allen clone. He just never ran much. And now no J.K. Dobbins. And so like, that's one way to frame it. The other way to frame it is like, or he's still Harbaugh's J.J. McCarthy, because like we haven't really seen any spike weeks from him. He has 2 games over 20 DK all year, and he's freaking 22 to 25% owned. I'm going to fade him just based off of that ownership. But one thing I do think is interesting is maybe getting unique with him, because the McConkey plus Herbert is going to be massive. Our guy, Ryan Heath, he's our new full-time hire. I call him the golden boy just because like, dude never misses. He's awesome. he doesn't like this spot for McConkey. McConkey, by the way, who, I think is going to be a league winner in season-long leagues in the fantasy playoffs. I think he's a superstar. I think he's awesome. It's just like the volume hasn't been there, and it's a reverse slot funnel. It's a perfectly unideal schematic matchup. And so I actually think like if you were to play Herbert, it would be interesting to look at a Will Dissly who has a perfect schematic match, a Quentin Johnson who I hate and I think sucks, but has had some decent games, or Josh Palmer who ranked top 5 in XFP last week, just like David Moore, but just didn't convert on those targets. And so maybe that's a unique angle to play it. Or I don't really know though. To me, it's just you see that ownership you auto fade, and like according to what you're showing, it seems like you'd back that up.
Yeah. So one, I love John Proctor. Actually, fun fact: John Proctor actually came and visited me and my wife out in Colorado when he was out there a couple years ago. Him and his wife came through. Terrific people. Love them. They met Damascus when he was very young. But I'm going to disagree with him on the Justin Herbert is running more. Justin Herbert, while he is running more, he has an 8% designed rush attempt rate. That is not necessarily all that high. In fact, that's 13th best in the league over the course of the entire season. Guys like Caleb Williams at 9%, Sam Darnold at 10%, Bo Nix at 11%. Like all of these guys have higher designed rush attempts. And they all kind of like match in the scrambles too. It's 6% scramble. So I guess you can say that he's running a little bit more, but like it's negligible. I think that accounts to something like maybe 2-3 rushing attempts per game, of which maybe those can break, right? Like from a prop standpoint, I think that matters a little bit more, but from DFS standpoint, it's just, it's a nothing burger, I think. And to your point on Lan McConkey, the reason why I haven't really been on Charger stacks is because their volume is low. Like Justin Herbert is only averaging 33 dropbacks per game. For perspective, Kyler Murray is at 32. Sam Darnold is at 34. Josh Allen is at 34. Like that, there's a lot of guys that have just higher dropback rates than Justin Herbert. And I
will say, just to be fair, it has picked up in a big way these last few weeks, and no J.K. Dobbins this week. So maybe that changed the equation. Maybe rushing touchdown upside climbs.
I would say,
Scott, the reason. So I totally understand all that. Like I understand like Dobbins being out. I understand that recently the pass rate has gone better. He's had a couple of primetime games also that people have watched, which always, influences everybody a little bit more. My biggest sort of opposition to that is simply ownership. I mean, that when you have 17 stacks here, including, Burrow in a great game, Hurts and Jackson in an incredibly high total game, Hurts also facing a pass funnel that people have been picking on all year against Baltimore. Stafford with Kupp and Puka, who both project magnificently, but Stafford looks unknown for some reason. I just feel like if we didn't have good alternatives and this was like a small, like 8-game slate or something, I'd be more comfortable with it. But, and maybe he won't be as chalky as he's projecting right now. It's possible that the whole field sort of comes to the same conclusion I'm coming down to. I just think that, we have to remember the game we're playing here, which is that we're trying to beat the field. And so to me, the alternatives that you have at much lower ownership with equal, if not higher medians and ceilings, you're just sacrificing too much leverage by playing him. It's not that I don't like Herbert. It's just that I think there's really good alternatives at much lower ownership.
So here's the thing that I will say. It's cheap. It's a cheap stack. At 15.7 for Herbert, McConkey, and Dissly, 15.7 is cheap. But to that point, I agree with you. It's very similar stacks to me thematically are Tampa Bay and Minnesota, where both of those are kind of reliant on the exact same thing happening. But Tampa Bay has a team total of 26.5, and Mayfield plus Evans plus Otton, which is just the stack that you would go with by default, is not going to be high owned, and only costs 17.8. It's only $2,000 more. So it's not that much harder. I agree with both of you guys. I think that Herbert stacks are just going to be well overvalued. Similar to what we were talking about with T. Higgins, I would like to play Lad McConkey by himself. I just don't want Justin Herbert. I think the volume's relatively low. I think the price tag is nice, but I think there are considerably better stacks. I am really into trying to fit together a Philly Baltimore or a Philly Baltimore stack. Because I think that game, I like betting on good offenses to score a lot of points. That's just a heuristic that I like. And when two good offenses face each other, it's kind of, Buffalo versus Kansas City or Philadelphia versus Baltimore, name X, Y, or Z, two good offenses is usually going to be a good stack. And I do think that we actually have the value to make it work. If you're using Chase and Adonai, and I'm not going to fucking touch David Moore, but the stack would be low enough owned that I could if I wanted to. Because I have enough relative value that I could eat 25% on David Moore if I wanted to poison myself. But all that said, I think we're all in agreement. But before we move on to kind of like the last pieces of these chalk things, Scott, did you want to mention anything more about the stacks that we're looking at here?
Yeah, I just gave away what I'm doing. Stafford doubles in the double spy, and then Burrow hurts Baker in the 3 max power sweep, and then AR-15 plus Adonai in the spy. I think that's what I'm going to do. The only critique would be one question would be so it'd be Burrow, Chase, Pickens, Higgins probably. But could I also play Chase Brown? Should I play him instead of T. Higgins? That's a question for you guys. Other one would be, I'm not going to play Devonta Smith. I think so AJ Brown's one of my favorite plays in the entire slate. Part of the reasoning being, so he has the second best yards per route run in fantasy points data history, the best yardage market share in fantasy points data history, meaning there's like not much left over for anyone else. And then, insane yards per route run. This is the matchup where the Eagles, who rank dead last in pass attempts per game, that skyrockets. So I think I would just go AJ Brown plus Zay Flowers, but you can let me know if I'm leaving too much upside on the table. We also, by the way, didn't talk Saquon and Derrick Henry as GPP plays. I like them a lot at sub 5%. And then Baker, Evans, Otten. Yeah, I think that's it.
Well, that's the thing about this more spot is that all of the good plays are 5% and under. Like AJ Brown is 6%.
Yeah.
Saquon 5%. Like, I know that it's hard to fit Jalen Hurts and Lamar Jackson, but they're going to be relatively low on too. Like, it's such a good spot, and you just have to be able to eat some kind of shitty low own or some shitty value. But I think we have good enough value to make it work. Pablo, you were going to say something there.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. Number one, I obviously agree with both of you in terms of that game environment. I think we'd be remiss not to play at least one lineup if you're playing a few in GPPs at that ownership with that upside. I'm always tempted to pair my tight end with a quarterback. We've talked about it as being sort of analogous to playing a catcher as part of your baseball stack. It's just, it's a position where it's always going to be correlated to your quarterback. And so if your quarterback is going to do well, if you can fit a play that's comfortable, I don't know how I feel about Goddard. I mean, he 41 feels pretty darn cheap for him. I have to be honest. Like I know it's not a super sexy play, and I could easily see Jalen Hurts skinny stacks with AJ Brown being fine. I think it's worth pointing out how cheap he is in a game with such a high total. I wouldn't be that surprised to see AJ Brown and Goddard both get there. In terms of Chase Brown, Tribe talks about this a lot. Shout out Tribe, which is that the field generally is sort of not willing to pair a quarterback with the running back enough. Now, I think that's more true for certain running backs who have more of a pass catching role. I don't know. You guys are heavier into the sort of targets than I am. But my impression is that Chase Brown is more of a running back that runs than one that catches a lot of passes.
No, he has 8 targets over the last 3 weeks, leads all running backs in route share.
Okay,
Yeah.
well there you go. So then I'd be perfectly fine doing it. I think given that usage and people, I mean, that's probably an assumption. I'm usually a good example of a square play because whatever I assume, I'm assuming your single entry cash players are assuming. And so I can promise you a lot of people are assuming that.
Yeah.
And so I'm totally fine playing Burrow with the Chase Brown. And I think that's actually a really interesting way to build frequently, is to just be willing to play running back with the quarterback. It has to be in the right spots for guys who get the usage. The other thing I just wanted to ask you guys about was to go back to Stafford. So Stafford doubles immediately jumped out to me on this slate. But two things gave me pause. One thing gave me pause, really. The thing that gave me pause is what you're showing, which is that while the stack looks wonderful, and while you can use Puka and Cup, for whatever reason, across the industry, and ETR has it very similarly, Stafford himself does not project very well, which makes me wonder, is there something going on with that offense in terms of it either being a Puka game or a Cup game, where even though it's enticing to double them with Stafford, they're not frequently both getting there? Because that's the only way I can explain Stafford's median being so low and his 2x, 3x being so low. But maybe you guys can explain it to me. Why is Stafford projecting so poorly when the stack itself looks so good?
Well, I always smash this week because I think projections are bad this week. It's because, people are distracted. It's 2 main slates in 1 week. People are traveling, they have family stuff and, Thanksgiving dinners. So I think for this week historically is a week I smash. Projections I think are bad. But you look at what Stafford's done since Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua came back. He leads all quarterbacks in passing yards, second in passing touchdowns. He's averaging over 20 fantasy points per game. And this is the same thing last year too. Last year, when Puka and Cooper Kupp were healthy on the field with Stafford, they didn't just lead the league in EPA per play. They would have ranked top 10 this past decade. And so it's just such a force multiplier when you have those 2 studs healthy and on the field. And then what's so great about it, same with the Bengals, by the way, is how highly concentrated this offense is. Right now, Puka Nacua leads all players at all positions in targets per route run. Cooper Kupp ranks second, and they're combining for like a 66% first read target share in games they're playing together. That's the exact same thing with the Bengals as well. And so I kind of see them as positively correlated, and it just feels so immensely safe to me. The big issue here would be the Saints not showing up, but I mean, look at the implied point totals on this week. It's Ravens 1. Okay. Makes sense. And then it's Buccaneers 0.5 behind that. And the Rams 0.75 behind that. It was really, they're expecting the Rams to put up a lot of points. Maybe it's Kyron on the ground, but we're not seeing that. Since these guys came back, Kyron, who isn't getting targets, all of his fantasy production is coming inside the red zone. And we've seen, maybe this is just an outlier, but we've seen the Rams jump from being top 5 run heavy to top 5 pass heavy inside the 10-yard line. Maybe that's a fluke. I don't know, but that's what we're seeing. And so maybe the Saints don't show up. Maybe, I don't know, but I'm trying to fade Kamara, but like he's projecting as like the second best running back play. Taysom Hill, I love, has a ton of upside. Even MVS. I mean, there's a chance he has more touchdown upside than Kamara, because what we're seeing is like, how do the Saints score points? It's big, explosive, deep shots, typically to MVS, or goal line carries to Taysom. I don't know. I've thought this through. I think it's a little tricky, but and I'm also a little biased. I took down the red zone last year with the Stafford double stack. So I don't know. It feels really safe to me. Highly concentrated offense. I think Stafford is right there. I think he's a better value than Darnold in a sneaky bad matchup. I think he's right there with Herbert and some of these other names that are drawing more ownership.
Yeah, I will say that I think that I am too low on Stafford. I will agree with you both on that. I think that over the last couple weeks, I just pulled up some some stats here. So over the last 4 weeks, Matthew Stafford, 40.75 dropbacks per game, 38 pass plays per game, 8.5 ADOT, 7.38 yards per attempt, all really good numbers. PPR 18.4 PPR points per game. I think that those are kind of like with an expectation. The thing is, when you look at that, if you want to assume that I'm a little bit too low on him and you want to give him 1.5 points, like that jumps him up into this Joe Burrow range, and I'm fine with that. But you still have Baker Mayfield, Joe Burrow, Jaden Daniels, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson. At 5,800, he is a good play. And I'm pretty sure that in the contest sims, like he is still, I have not even pulled these up yet. But yeah, Matthew Stafford still shows up in 11% of winning lineups in the contest sims. Like the contest sims really like paying down at quarterback because you have Anthony Richardson at 5,500, who the contest sims just have a fucking hard on for. Sam Darnold at 5,900, Justin Herbert 56, Matthew Stafford 58. And then Lamar Jackson shows up, 3% or whatever. But a lot of it is just going to be these cheaper guys. And there's reasons for that because it is hard to get the expensive quarterbacks with any upside. But I agree with you guys that Matthew Stafford, I think, is too cheap. I think that he probably should be projected somewhere between 17.5 and 18.5, 19-ish. And he does, we have seen, have one of the highest ceilings of any gunslinging quarterback in the league. I mean, I think his ceiling is higher than Sam Darnold. I think his ceiling is higher than, Justin Herbert for sure. I think his ceiling is for sure higher than Justin Herbert. I think he's right on par there with Joe Burrow and Baker Mayfield in terms of like guys who are actually throwing the ball for their upside rather than running it in. So,
also over this hot streak, I said he leads all quarterbacks in passing yards. 4 of the 5 defenses he faced are top 12 pass defenses. The one defense he faced was bottom 12, which is basically what this Saints defense is without Marshawn Lattimore. He had 4 touchdowns, 295 passing yards against the Patriots. So I like the spot for him. I think it really comes down to the Saints scoring points, but yeah.
Well, and to be clear, people think about blowouts like that in kind of the wrong way, where what you think is, oh, well, if the Saints don't score a whole bunch of points, then it lowers the upside of the Rams. That's not true. The Rams could put up 35 real-life points, blow them the fuck out of the water, and then sit their starters in the fourth, but all 35 of those points could go to Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp through 4 touchdowns thrown by Matthew Stafford.
That's also
not Scott, you brought something up.
McVay is someone who typically keeps his foot on the gas in the fourth quarter. Go ahead, Pablo.
No, you also brought something up, which I think is interesting, which is there's a few spots this week where you sort of say to yourself, like, if I'm not playing this guy and that game still scores points, should I play these other guys, right? And we've hit on most of them, but I think it's worth mentioning it. So T. Higgins is one, right? So like if you're not playing Burrow stacks, you're probably playing Chase Brown. We talked about the fact you can still play Chase Brown as part of a Burrow stack, but if you're not playing Chase Brown, you should probably be considering playing a Burrow stack unless you just don't think that game has any points because someone's got to score in that game if it's not Chase Brown, and it's probably going to be Higgins and Chase, or at least Chase. The other one you just mentioned, which I think has been tricky, and I'm curious as to how sticky the results have been or will be from what we've seen in the last few weeks, which is Kamara versus Hill. I understand they're not like directly inversely correlated, but they're pretty like they are. If Hill goes fucking crazy, and I understand there's a world in which they both do okay, and one of them doesn't do shitty and the other does amazing. But what we've seen now a few times has Hill gone nuts and Kamara's done fine, but nowhere close to what he had to do at his price. And I don't know if it's, but James, you're going to say he dropped that one pass and he still would have gotten
No. I'm not. I'm going to give you a comparison, and that's going to blow you guys' mind. All right, Alvin Kamara and Taysom Hill are just the same plays as Christian McCaffrey and Deebo Samuel. They're the same shit.
Mine is blown.
That's the same shit. So if you put it that way, would you play Deebo Samuel at $5K?
Yeah. Fuck yeah.
I mean, you would, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so now the next question. Would you play Deebo Samuel and Christian McCaffrey together if Deebo Samuel was 5K?
Yeah.
Yes, you would. You absolutely would.
Here's my critique of that. I think that's a great way to frame it. So like, because Kamara can get there without touchdowns. Like, I think he has like a season high 35 fantasy points without a touchdown and a season high like 45 with a touchdown. One thing that gives me pause and like why I like Taysom. So Taysom, bro, Taysom might be my favorite player in the NFL. I think he's so underrated. You see all this Travis Hunter hype. Dude, Taysom Hill is above average at 4 positions and elite at special teams in the NFL, one of the most underrated players ever. He ranks right now top 5 among all players at all positions in fantasy points per snap. His snap share just jumped from 40% to 55% in his last game. Clint Kubiak said earlier this week, and alluded to it multiple different times on multiple different days, he's ready to play Taysom every snap of the game now. Oh. I don't know that I buy that. I don't know that I probably 60%, let's say. But like the expectation for that for a guy who ranks top 5 in fantasy points per snap is massive. And like any uptick in snap share, I feel like has to come at Alvin Kamara's expense, who's older, is dealing with a broken hand. And he's just like so good, and he's so good inside the red zone. So that's where, you know, I've been kind of waffling back and forth, or at least like a point of conflict for me.
Yeah, just
and then let me ask you guys. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say before you jump on your thoughts here, I just wanted to give a little bit of background to Alvin Kamara. So he's been dealing with a broken hand, and yet has a 77% snap share, 66% of the rushing attempts, 70% route participation, 24% of the targets, a 28% targets per route run, which is hilarious for a running back, 70% of long distance snaps, 100% of the N5 rushing attempts. And over at Fantasy Life, Dwayne has put together a conglomerate score called utilization score, which is 9.8, which is good for about 22 fantasy points per game. Only behind our boy Chase Brown over the last 3 weeks in terms of PPR and utilization. So with a broken hand, still that.
Yeah. So I can't deny the usage is elite. It's actually not as good as Chase Brown's these last 3 weeks, but the dude also doesn't have 5 touchdowns in his last 5 games.
He's due.
That's fair. If you wanted to pull that out, he also has 1 game over 18.5 since week 5. I don't know. So like, it's just, to me, I guess it just comes down to ownership. Second chalkiest running back play of the slate. It feels like a cash play to me. And like, for sure, jam him in cash, but more of a cash play than a tournament play where it's like Joe Mixon. I kind of like
Joe Mixon. We have to mention him. I mentioned him at the beginning, but like, I will admit I was a bit of a Joe Mixon hater on his way out of Cincinnati. I was like, Joe Mixon.
Who does steroids the year after they get the big contract?
But he has been unreal. Like, I don't know if people like do I don't know. Unless you watch Houston games, I don't know that you would realize how good he's been. Like, to the naked eye, he looks incredible. Yeah. And this is a spot where Houston should absolutely smash. I mean, they should absolutely smash, and it would be completely unsurprising to see Mixon get there, right? Let me ask you guys about Tampa real quick, because that's the other one that you mentioned, Mike Evans. I do think Bucky Irving is going to be pretty chalky. We've seen him sort of take the reins over the last couple weeks. I will say I don't think Rachaad White has been completely phased out. If you're playing Baker, I think you're probably playing him with Mike Evans and Cade Otton. I don't know how excited you'd be to play Bucky Irving. I think it's just another one of those spots where you're sort of saying to yourself, okay, Chase Brown versus Bengals pass catchers. You're saying to yourself, the other ones I mentioned. What are your thoughts, Scott, on how Tampa is most likely to get there against what is still a really bad Carolina team? Because I don't know. I think Bucky will be pretty darn owned. I think him, Kamara, Chase Brown will probably be the highest owned sort of trio running back group used. I don't think he'll be anywhere as close to as owned as Chase Brown will. Arguably, he shouldn't be. But what I'm asking you, I guess, is how fragile do you think Bucky Irving is in terms of his projection versus using Mike Evans, Kate Otten? Because I think that's a bit of a pivot point.
Yeah, I think he's absolutely fragile, Chuck. He had his best usage of the season last week by target share, snap share, route share, XFP, actual fantasy points. But even then, it was still just a 46% of the backfield XFP. He hasn't been over 55% in any game this season. It's really like very close to a 50-50 split with some random fluctuations with no rhyme or reason as to why one player has more than the other. And it's also Sean Tucker was getting the goal line work last week. And maybe that pops back up again this week. We don't really know, in which case it's a even grosser three-way committee. I mean, Irving can still get there just because it's the nuts matchup. But to me, it's an easy fade. And I want to be betting on Baker Mayfield, who I think is like easily one of the most underrated players in fantasy this year. Oh, yeah. Buccaneers have the second highest implied point total of the week. I know it's, what if the Panthers don't show up? They've been playing a lot better of late. What if they just lean super run heavy? That's not what this Buccaneers offense has done. And this is not what teams have done against the Panthers. Like, they don't show up and teams are still airing it out on him. No quarterback has more games with 27 DraftKings fantasy points than Baker. Just 0.5 DK away from the QB2 of the slate. But he's 1,100 less than the QB2. He was on pace for 460 passing yards last week at halftime before they basically just shut everything down. I could see him going like all these numbers I just cited. And by the way, Mike Evans hasn't cleared a 60% snap share in each of his last 5 games. And so like the upside to me is immense. I could see him being a touchdown hog. Heading into last week, Tampa had 24 passing touchdowns, third most, to only 6 rushing touchdowns for the running backs. And Mayfield himself had 3 rushing touchdowns. And so 6,600, I don't know what the projections are saying, but to me, he's a top value and like certainly a top upside upside projection value. And the stack is easy. Mike Evans, Uber Alpha, and then it's Kate Otten. Okay, his usage slipped last week. It was a worst possible matchup. Now he gets a best possible matchup, and his price dropped by 1K. And so he certainly excites me more than any of the running backs. I think I'm going to grab a beer in a second if you don't mind, but I think there's a case to be made for Rachaad White as leverage. But I don't know what his ownership is for you guys. If he's like sub 5%, I like that. If not, I don't even think I'll mess around with it.
I think he will be, but I'll give you another reason why Bucky Irving is going to be really chalky, which is going to make you guys even happier to maybe consider him fragile. And that's because people are going to look at Irving and Moore as like as a salary saving mini. Like everyone's going to say Irving Moore. Like Irving Moore is going to be probably the chalkiest value combination on the slate.
We're going to make so much money this week.
Please, yes, let's go.
So I think that Mike Evans and Kate Otten, I think that combination is terrific. I'm showing ownership and projections right now for Tampa Bay. And Mike Evans projected pretty well. He should be popular. I don't think that you're going to get an ownership discount on Mike Evans, but you are going to get an ownership discount on Kate Otten, and you're going to get a big ownership discount on Baker Mayfield. When we looked at stacks earlier, Tampa Bay stacks looked really, really good. And Carolina, I mean, they are the best running back matchup in the league, just plain and simple. But Bucky Irving, even in his best game last week, only had 47% of the snaps, 44% of the rushing attempts. Like you said, he did not hold, a true bell cow role. There's no reason why it couldn't be Rachaad White that has the game this week. There's no reason why Sean Tucker couldn't have 2 rushing touchdowns and be like a massive value this week. Yep. There's plenty of ways that it's not Bucky Irving. And I think that the best way for it to not be Bucky Irving is to stack with Baker Mayfield, Kate Otten, and Mike Evans, which I think as we close out the season, I think they're going to try to get Mike Evans to that 1,000-yard mark. I think that they're going to feature him and Kate Otten together. And I think that we're going to see some really, really good games. And I would guess probably something like a 50% combined target share, along with like 55% of the air yards, like elite metrics between Cade Otton and Mike Evans together as a combo, because they really, Cade Otton is a fucking baller. He's good. And Mike Evans, obviously Hall of Famer, like argue with a wall about it if you don't think he's already in the Hall of Fame. Those two combined, I think are going to be really good. So I totally buy the Tampa Bay stack. I did want to, as we're kind of like ramping down on this pod and on this show, is there anything that we really miss? I don't think so. We talked about Chase Brown. We talked about the hilarious. Don't fucking play David Moore tomorrow. Just please, if you tuned into this, even if you don't care about me and only care about Scott, if you tuned into this, don't fucking play David Moore. Just play Adonai Mitchell, who I think. But the thing that I will say about Adonai Mitchell, this is what I wrote for I think Fantasy Life. I don't see any reason why Adonai Mitchell wouldn't be able to step directly into the kind of upside that Josh Downs had in this offense. I don't see any reason why he couldn't. I think that, one, he's really good. He's actually a legit good wide receiver. Same thing as Josh Downs. They do not run the same routes, to be fair. That they don't have the same target tree, but I think that what this offense likes to do is find one wide receiver. That's what Anthony Richardson likes to do. And that one wide receiver has been either Josh Downs or Alec Pierce, and not so much Michael Pittman. I think those guys don't really mesh very well together. So I really like Adonai Mitchell at 3,900. I think that I could project him for 15 fantasy points and feel totally fucking fine about it. I project him for 12 here. I think I could project him for more.
So James, before we close that, I want to say one thing real quick, because you don't hype yourself enough, and I feel the need to do it for you a little bit. Scott mentioned at the beginning your tools. So I just want to make sure for people who haven't been on Paydirt before, I met James when he was at Number Ball, and what immediately blew me away was the earlier Excel version that we had of what we're looking at right now, which is much easier to use and more streamlined, which is that James's stuff is built on ranges of outcomes. So you can look at a player, a price, you can look at their chances of 2x, 3x, 4xing, you can look at them by salary, you can look at stacks. It's the right way to think about probability. People who are smart at sort of probabilistic games, whether it's poker or DFS, they don't think binary. They don't think of good or bad. They think about relative value, alternatives, and ranges of outcomes. And they think about 70th, 80th, 90th percentile outcome ceiling, median, floor. They don't look at it as just one metric, right? We've gone from median, which kind of was what people used to do, to ceiling. And then also looking at that across the board in combination with your stack, in combination with ownership, leading to leverage. So I know I'm saying a lot really fast. It's a long-winded way of saying, if you haven't been on Paydirt, you should check out the tools, because it's a very powerful way to think about probability, and it's the way we should all be playing DFS. And it's the way that really good players like Scott naturally approach slates. But it makes it a lot more intuitive, and it kind of helps you figure out why you feel the way you feel, and maybe if you should feel a little bit differently than you did when you're looking at these range of outcomes in combination with ownership. So I just want to point that out to folks who haven't been on the site.
Well, thank you, Mr. Guy, who really blows my ass up. I appreciate it. I do think that that the way that these things are built, if you have not used the tools, you absolutely should. But from a high level, I guess for my closing thoughts, I think the slate is really, really good. I like slates. If you have read any of my Showdown seasons, I like slates where what you end up doing is looking for like one or two ways to pass the field. Like I don't even really care what they are. I just want to find one or two ways where I can say, I don't fucking want this person. I can X them out of my pool and I can pass the field organically. What I call it is playing without luck. I think that slates where you're eating all of the chalk, you need a lot of luck in your roster construction and your outcomes to even sniff first place. Whereas with a slate like this, if I can just simply, based on ownership, say, I'm not fucking playing David Moore, and there's probably no chance I'm playing Bucky Irving, like I can cancel out what's probably going to be about 50% of the field and then just build optimally I don't even have to care at that point, right? Like I have enough relative value because I'm passing 50% of the field on that.
Wow.
Not to mention I'm not playing Justin Herbert, right? That's another subset portion where it's probably, there's going to be like 5 or 6% overlap there. So
is it really that simple? I feel like I go too contrarian then.
It's really that simple in smaller fields, in something like, if I'm playing the Wildcat or if I'm playing like the 555 Millie Maker or something like that, I don't have to do that much more because if 50% of the field is tying themselves to these guys who I think have really low floors and they end up scoring like 7 fantasy points, so long as within those positions, like the pivots that you made outscore that 7 fantasy points, like you still have win equity. You have so much more relative value by just doing that. In the Millie Maker, it's different, right? Like in the Millie Maker, you probably have to get away from David Moore and Bucky Irving and find some sort of leverage off of Chase Brown or Alvin Kamara or something like that. Like you need one more layer on top of that in large field. But in small field, like slates where I get to just fade David Moore and Bucky Irving and Justin Herbert. And like, even if I wanted to go one step above that and play Gus Edwards and leverage the Justin Herbert chalk that way, that's a really easy slate for me. And I know that I can play it really, really well. So I'm excited for the slate. I think that for me, the way that I look at it, I'm probably going to have Chase Brown in every line. Even after this conversation, even after Pablo tried to talk me off of it, I can't. I just think that he's at least $1,500 underpriced, if not like $2,000 underpriced.
But James, it's related to what you just said. I mean, it's related to what you just said because you're already fading Bucky Irving. You're already fading Herbert, right? So it's fine. Like, why fade a really good piece of chalk?
Right.
I think even if you are eating chalk, that's not the piece you fade. My point was just a bigger one, which is that I think Chase Brown is really good chalk. I think we all agree on that. It's just if you've already made the decision that you're not playing a Herbert double, which is going to be chalky, plus Kamara, plus Bucky Irving and David Moore. All right, fine. You already have enough leverage. Like just eat the good chalk and Chase Brown, right? Right. Anyway,
that's right. So I'm going to lock him in like pretty clearly. If I don't have Chase Brown, I will have Cincinnati stack. I do think that Cincinnati scores points one way or another. I think that Chase Brown plus T Higgins without Joe Burrow is really interesting. I think both those guys are way undervalued. I love trying to get a Baltimore Philly stack. I love trying to get a Tampa Bay stack. I love the Rams. Scott, I'm pretty much deadlocked with you on stacks. I think that all of those make sense. Anthony Richardson plus Adonai Mitchell, I think is a really, really nice, solid base you can start with. Although I will say, I think it is going to be way more popular than we are projecting. That's the only caveat there. I do think that Adonai Mitchell is going to be 20% owned. But outside of that, the only other thing that I think that we really talked about and that I'm on board now is if I'm going to compare Taysom Hill to Deebo Samuel and say, would I play Deebo Samuel at 5K? I should probably fucking play Taysom Hill at 5K. So yeah, I think this is going to be a really good week. Scott, do you have any closing thoughts here?
Yeah, I just want to say, so the Jets just elevated Kenny Nwangwu. Breece Hall is questionable. If Breece Hall is out, Braylon Allen would be like an elite play. He actually would still come in under Chase Brown, but well ahead of Alvin Kamara in our projections. And so the last thing I did want to talk about, because this is where I was at earlier in the week, was I might want to make a rule that I would have AJ Brown or Saquon Barkley on 100% of my lineups. I'm not going to do that. I'm not even going to come close to that, but I do love Saquon. I do love AJ Brown. I think he's like him and Adonai Mitchell are far and away my favorite GPP wide receiver plays of the slate, with or without Lamar or Jalen Hurts. And then, but I want to talk Barkley and also Derrick Henry as an extension of that. Both are coming in 5% or less, right? Saquon Barkley has scored 36 plus DraftKings fantasy points in 50% of his freaking games. All other running backs combined for just 4 such games this year. Saquon Barkley has like 6, right? And the dude is having one of the best seasons in recent memory. He's only 8,500. Christian McCaffrey was like 10K at the end of last year, and he's only 4%. I know it's not the matchup for it. I know they're not favored in this game, but just that slate breaking upside relative to ownership, especially relative to price. Like it feels like it should be illegal for Saquon to ever be under 10%, and we're showing 4%. And then Derrick Henry is kind of the same thing. In games Baltimore won by over 1 point, he's averaging 27.4 DK fantasy points per game. They're favored in this game. We're showing 5%. And so I feel like those guys could just be absolute slate wreckers. I know we all like Jalen, we all like Lamar and those stacks, but it's, what if just one of those running backs ends up taking over the game? So that would be the last thing I wanted to bring up and pick your guys' thoughts on.
Really quick before Pablo, I'll let you answer some of those, but I just built out a Baltimore stack here in the little quick builder with Chase Brown, Adonai Mitchell, and Taysom Hill. And you got $8,500 left over for running back in the defense. I'm just saying, you can absolutely do this with AJ Brown, Zay Flowers, Mark Andrews.
Wow.
And Taysom Hill. You can do it. You can do it. So, yeah, we're going to fucking smash.
And there are good, cheap defenses this week.
Yeah, there are. Pablo, you got any closing thoughts here?
No, I mean, I think what Scott's pointing out is that this week people are really locking into very common build structures across the field. Like there's going to be really condensed macro build structure. It's going to be the cheap quarterback with more Irving, pay up for Kamara, your mid-range wide receivers. And I think if you're willing to, this is a really good week for people who are willing to say, you know what, I think the industry is wrong. And here's the chalk I think is bad. And here are the pay up flex positions I'm going to spend at sub 10% ownership, and I'm going to win the GPP that way. Like Barkley is a great example of that. AJ Brown is like, I don't even know, like he's not going to be sneaky, but like he's not projecting as like massive owned, and like
he should be
this matchup for AJ Brown, like this is the matchup for AJ Brown that we had for Nico Collins like 3 or 4 weeks ago when we were like, you have to have Nico Collins this week, right? He ended up doing fine, but he got hurt.
Jamar Chase averages 50 fantasy points per game against Baltimore this year. Why can't AJ Brown do that when he's more efficient on a
like? I don't understand. Like I do understand why AJ Brown's not going to be that owned, and it's because the build structure everyone's using doesn't allow for it. And my point is the same point you both are making, which is the way you win NFL DFS is you lean into the game theory and you say to yourself, okay, like everyone's building it this way. It's kind of like become a meme with the Ian or whatever his fucking name is, who drops the tweets where he says everyone's building like this, you should build like this. Yeah. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? The everyone's building like this, but you should build like this tweet. By the way, like 90% of the time, like you should build like this. This like doesn't make any sense. But anyway, I think if you're willing to build in an intelligent way that's different from the field, this is a really, really good week to get upside. That you just have to be. This is a hard week for people who like playing a lot of chalk, because some of the chalk is good. Like Chase Brown is really good chalk. But then some of the chalk is a little shakier. Like we've talked about all the shaky chalk this week. And so it takes a little bit of guts to say, you know what, I'm going to play a little bit different. I'm going to play these pay up players like AJ Brown, or if you can get to Barkley at 0 ownership. But honestly, I mean, that's why people who are willing to get a little different tend to win GPPs, right? I mean, you have to separate from the field. So it's exciting. Right. I'm looking forward to it. And I think all of us are willing to get different in a creative way. And I would just encourage everybody who is listening to not be scared to just be a little different, because that's how you win in DFS. That's how you win in DFS.
Absolutely. You also win by subscribing to PayDirtDFS.com. Boom! Look at that transition. Anyway, if you are not subscribed to PayDirtDFS.com, you should be. Lots of tools. We just did a really long video with me and Sheets going over like everything that's on the site for NFL and NBA, and he was really impressed. We have monthly, yearly, weekly, and daily subscription options. So if you tuned in today and you just want to spend $5 on a day pass, see what it's all about, you can absolutely do that. You can go to the subscribe options and, do that. The Discord is free to join as well. There's a Discord link for members as well. There's a newsletter. There's all those kind of things. But overall, even if you don't subscribe, even if you hate me, Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for supporting the channel, and thanks for supporting me. This has been
Can I give a plug?
What?
Can I give a plug?
Yeah, you can plug. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're running a Black Friday sale. So if you want premium access, it's only $10 until March 31st, or the all-in package, which includes data, is only $40. So there's plenty of slates left, all the way to week 18, and then we have playoffs. So hop in the Discord, read my slate breakdown. I honestly think we're a perfect pairing, James, because I think I'm really good at the micro stuff, finding off the wall plays people aren't on, or fragility and chalk. And I think you are an elite game theory guy, which is my weak spot. So if you want to pair up those subs, whether you're a fan of Fantasy Points or you're a fan of James, I think that's really smart to do. And if you haven't checked out James' Theory of DFS audiobook, I cannot recommend that enough. I for whatever reason, it's just not something that comes naturally to me. I'm going to have to listen to it again, but no coincidence, I listened to all of it last year, and I had my most profitable DFS season ever. So shout out to you guys. And if you're interested, check out fantasypoints.com.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was going to cut you off there. I don't usually have people who actually have something to push other than me. So yeah, definitely check out Fantasy Points. I think that basically, without a doubt, best fantasy data suite in the industry. I mean, like bar none. It's not even close. I use them frequently. And I think that, people can get lost in the weeds, but I think they do a really, really good job of making it so while there's a lot of data to look at, a lot of the data points that they use point to very specific things. And, there's something for everybody where you can go in, get your data that you need to use just on your short process, or you can dive in for weeks. I think they do a really, really good job. And everybody, thanks Scott for joining the call, even though he texted me back an hour before we went live and was like, yeah, sure, I'll fucking jump on. So thanks for coming on, Scott. I really appreciate it.
I had a blast. We should do this again.
We should absolutely do this again. With that being said, I have a sushi date that I have to go on. Margaret's going to yell at me when I get off this call. But love you guys. Thank you. And that's going to be it for us. I hope somebody wins a trophy this week, and we can brag about it on Twitter. All right.